Welcome to Wayward Writers. We are very excited today to be with you. I am Heather Cashman.
And I'm Stephanie Bearce.
And we're here today with Michelle Hauck, who is my amazing colleague at Storm Literary Agency. And we're happy to have her today with us to talk about world building. So, Stephanie, will you tell us more about Michelle?
I would be happy to. As you just said, Michelle is a literary agent with Storm Agency. She specializes in middle grade, young adult, and specific adult genres. Prior to this, she was the co-host of the writing contests Query Combat, Nightmare on Query Street, and Picture Book Party, and a 6-time Pitch Wars mentor. Her epic fantasy series was published with Harper Voyager. You can find her full bio on her website and her submission guidelines on the Storm Literary Agency.
Thanks. Hi, everybody.
Hi. We are so happy to have
Michelle,
you here.
it's so good.
And learn about world building, which I find fascinating.
Yes, I'm so excited to talk about it because there's such a range of world building all the way out to your token levels where you have invented whole languages for all these different cultures to all the way down to magical realism that just has maybe one magical element in the story. So world building is very exciting.
I love it too. Sometimes people think that world building isn't included in contemporary manuscripts. And I think the reality is that world building happens everywhere. Whenever you're creating a setting, you're making world building.
I totally agree, because even if it's contemporary and it's the world without magic or anything, you're still building this whole set of friendships and family and this world that only exists in the author's mind, and trying to get all of that to sync up and actually come out on the paper can be a lot. And then if you add in any form of magic or new rules to the world, it's a lot, but it's fascinating. I'm excited to talk about it.
Michelle, can you share the initial inspiration behind the worlds that you have created in your own books?
Yeah, a lot of times I'll just start with a setting. For instance, we went on a vacation to Tucson in the desert with all the different cactus and all the very scenic area. And I use that as a setting for one of my series. And you can just take the area of your story and decide what you're going to do with it, like the setting or maybe a basic part of the plot. And then you're off and running on your world building. All you need is one to get you started, because everything connects from there. If you have the setting and you have the weather, it's going to be a desert setting. Well, people living here are probably not going to be farmers, or if they're farmers, they're farming something very specific. And so all that is interconnected to what they can do for a living, what kind of people they might be, what kind of clothes they're going to wear, what kind of houses they're going to have. We know the food they eat, everything. Deciding even one part of your story can actually lead to deciding a lot of your world building. So you have to be very careful and make sure that you decide you start with the right thing, because it's going to carry forward into everything else you do.
Yeah, the world can be so critical. And what I really love about world building is so many times the world is actually a character in that book too. And how do you do that? How do you make sure that your world is so tight and so sound that it actually becomes a character in the book?
World building can be used for a lot of things, like character development, what clothes they wear, what weapons they carry, what other things they have, what they interact with can help showcase your character for you. It can help set the mood for your story by the way you describe the background scenes and everything. And if it's a scary story or a creepy story, or it really sets the tone for the story, as well as create obstacles for your plot and everything. So yeah, world building can really help you show also.
Yeah, I really like that, what you're saying about that creates obstacles in your plot, because you were talking about the desert area. Right there, the working with the lack of water, that just almost sets another enemy sometimes. Or the area can help the characters in some ways too. So it really is pretty critical where you decide to set and how you build the world.
Yeah. And for another way, you could, maybe you have the plot already figured out. Maybe it's going to be a fairy tale plot. And you can take that and think about normal fairy tales, the regular fairy tales that you see in a lot of stories. And you think, how can I twist that and make it different? What can I do with the world building that can make this fairy tale story completely unique?
Yeah. When you're going through, do you ever figure out, okay, the world's going to cause a problem here and cause a problem there? Or is it just more natural for you?
It's been pretty much, right as I go. I don't really plan or have an outline. Things will just come to me all of a sudden.
Okay. So a novel that Heather just sold, it's a realistic novel, but the setting is important to the actual story.
Mm-hmm.
And mine has no magic or anything like that. So I understand how building that world is just critical to what happens.
Even in a realistic setting, right? You're in the Ozark Mountains, right, and there's this kind of mystery creep factor. And so you have details about the world and you set a certain tone and all of that kind of thing. And then that setting becomes its own complete thing. And it can really affect the whole way that your manuscript feels and that atmospheric world. I love that when writers can create this just completely different atmosphere based on how they build their world and what happens in it.
Other people that have the fairy tale stuff, but out in the desert with the bright glaring sun and everything, it is amazing how the setting changes the atmosphere and what affects the characters and building that world. So anyways, I was going to ask also about, how do you make that real for your readers? Whatever world you have built, how do you make it feel just real and tangible that they're in that place? What details do you add?
Well, a lot of it is, adding in the economy, adding in the government, adding in religion. And there's a lot of worksheets out there you can find that'll help you, fill in those. If you're a person who likes to have all that set before you start writing, there's worksheets you can find that'll help you add in those details. What kind of money do they use? Are they trade? A lot of stories are kind of dystopian in that the government or the religion is a bad influence. It's not so much like a democracy a lot of times because there's more story plot potential in a bad religion, a bad government that's suppressing the people. But I think a lot of people forget to add in the history. And the history can really help to make the depth, to make the complexity that you need. If you're, say, writing an epic fantasy or really heavy science fiction or fantasy heavy on the world building, you want to make sure you have some history. If you have a statue, you make sure it's a statue to a dead king or something like that. And maybe there's an inscription on there and things that might come into play later. So if your hero or your heroine finds a enchanted sword later on, maybe they stumble across a picture of that in chapter 2, something like that, to set it up and give you a sense that there is a wider world and it's been there for a long time because it has this history. It has a past. Another thing that I think of a lot is a lot of world building I see are just shallow. They just do going into the bar, and the bars is an inn and a bar and a tavern, and they hang out or they meet some pirates or something. But to bring in the history, to bring in talk about what do they trade, what goods do they trade with other countries around them, and that gives it a little bit more depth. And I'm not saying every story needs that kind of a depth, because a lot of stories don't. But if you're looking for a really deep world building experience, then don't forget the history.
That makes so much sense, because when I think of just even our world today, like what's happening. The reason that things are happening in our world today is because of things that happened thousands of years ago and 1,000 years ago and 500 years ago. And you can't really understand the context of what's happening now with any society, really, unless you know the history of the society. So that does make a lot of sense that you really need that to have a fully realized world.
It makes total
right?
sense. And it also is totally frightening. That's a lot
Right.
of world to keep track
Backstory.
of. So how do you, oh my goodness.
I don't think you'd have to know all of it, though. I think you just need the key things that are influencing your character and what's happening in your plot. I think that would be the key. You don't have to create an entire world history civilization, but
No, you need the pieces that are affecting your character and the plot, and drop in a few other things once in a while when they're going through town. Here's a statue, here's a painting, here's a song about a history, that kind of.
Okay. Yeah. That really adds to the richness of your story then too.
Yeah. And I think too, the very first novel I ever wrote, I was writing and I was realizing that I was going places, and then I had the whole map of it in my head, right? So I think that's part of it too. Maps, geography. I have so many people in my queries say, I had this dream. Or
really?
like, my world is based on this dream that I had. I get that all the time in queries, and I think that's the way a lot of worlds begin. I do actually have a workshop on this coming up, but Michelle, how do you balance between creating detailed world building and the risk of overwhelming readers with information? That seems like a delicate balance.
It does depend on what kind of story you're writing. If you're writing a contemporary fantasy set in the real world, you don't need to detail every cup and silverware and TV and living room and house. If you're writing a deeper fantasy, a high fantasy, or a historical fantasy, then you probably want to get more into the detail. But you want to make sure those details tell you something about the character, something about the world building. You need to consider the world building as another character. So does the detail you're sharing really matter to driving the plot forward, or to the character world building? Is it going to add an obstacle? Is it going to add a point of conflict? Does it just make the world richer to know then? That is something that maybe you have to cut down a little after a while. I think most world building is heavier in the beginning. And then when anything major changes, when you go to a new setting, when you go to a big battle, or maybe when you introduce a new character. But the beginning is where the heaviest world building is probably going to be.
And that's a whole balancing act in and of itself, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Trying to not have too much world building so that you're just
get lost.
Yeah. Because that slows your pacing down too.
Yeah. If you're having paragraph after paragraph of world building, for a modern story in 2024, it's probably too much.
Yeah, it's not going to work. I see that all the time in my queries where people begin with setting, and it's just so hard to keep reading it sometimes because it's beautiful. Yeah, I can picture the setting, but it's hard for me to usually keep reading with a book that starts.
You have to pick your spots, and you have to keep it short usually. So not like if you read books from 20 years ago, even they could do more of just solid world building. But now we have to have action mixed in with that. We have to have really a scene going on, like a scene in a movie happening at the same time that we're learning about the characters, that they have to be doing something, that we're learning about the world. So you have to keep it short and spread it out.
That really is a balancing act to do that. And then also, I was just wondering about your characters and how they are involved in that world. How do you ensure that each character fits in that world, because you're going to have a variety of different, you're going to have the good guy and the bad guy, the outliers, the people who are high up. And how are you balancing that and putting all of that in your world?
I think in a lot of books that I'm seeing, a lot of stories, the majority of the secondary characters, I would say, are like people who do fit within the world. They're people who are rule followers and are having that same kind of common outlook and views in the world and following the rules and what's expected of them. But your main character is probably going to be the outlier.
Okay.
They're going to be the one who doesn't fit in quite right, who doesn't follow the rules quite right. Like in the Hunger Games and Katniss, and she was going outside and doing honey.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what most people were doing. They're going to be someone who maybe breaks the world building expectations a little bit. And the same for your antagonist. They're going to break it in other ways. I think a lot of times the characters will have, like in America, we have a certain fundamental beliefs that most of the country believes: personal freedom and a work ethic and the American dream. They're going to have that shared cultural background that they all believe in. So a good story, sometimes you'll take a character and they don't fit in that mold. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes it interesting.
So your supporting characters are really supporting the world that you've built. And then you're having your main character break it so you can see what happens with that.
Yeah. I think that makes for a good, interesting story a lot of times.
I think you're right. I hadn't thought of it that way, and I like that.
Kind of like in Beauty and the Beast with Belle. They're all singing to her, "Oh, you need to be like this, you need to be like that." And she's, "No, I don't. That's not how I am."
It's interesting.
I think the world building is what you can do to create what kind of expectations do the characters in this world have for what their life should look like.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so we talked about a lot of ways to make a world. Are there some things that you see all the time in your query inbox or things with writers that are common world building mistakes?
Like I said, I think leaving out the history is a common mistake. Just taking the world building that I would say is a universal world building, taking a universal European model of a fairy tale world and just using it without making your own twist on, I would say, is something that I see a lot in my queries.
Yeah, making it unique. I think that's true. Something I see is I see people who they build up a world and they have all these rules and everything and they're going along. And then for the twist of the story, they break a rule of the world. And I'm like, that's not a twist. That's an inconsistency.
So I think more of a twist would be changing the whole framework of the world around one person in that framework.
Yeah. Yeah.
What mistakes do you see, Michelle, that when things that just blow the world building for you when you're reading something?
Oh, sometimes they'll bring in something that's too modern that doesn't fit with the rest of the story and throw me out of the story. But usually if I pass on a query on a story, it's because for world building, it's because I didn't feel it was unique enough.
Okay. You're looking for something that's really unique, different.
Yeah. And the depth and the layers to it and complexity. So.
Yeah. And I love it when your world building interacts with your theme. Like, I like it when you have a certain theme in the story and the world that you build around that theme, like, plays against it in different ways.
Example of that?
Like Handmaid's Tale.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Where the themes like feminism and...
Yes.
Yeah. That's a good one because that really plays totally against everything in that.
Yeah. And you can build the world in such a way that it really emphasizes, or like simple as Jane Austen, right? Like the world that she lives in is what, and the rules of that world are what actually create the conflict for her, because she wants to marry for love, right? But her society really doesn't allow for that in many respects. Like, you have to marry whoever's going to provide for you. And so in that way, she should have done one thing, but she didn't, right? Like Michelle said, she was the outlier. And so I feel like even in just the rules of the world of Jane Austen, like, you can see the themes playing against each other, and there are different characters who follow the rules, and there are characters who don't. So.
And it's so complex. So, Michelle, what kind of research should we be doing? And how does research even play into this? Or does it? Does it just all come from our brain?
As a writer, I kind of research as I go. I don't have a grand plan or an ending in mind. You kind of do a lot of research as you go to find out very specific detail of your world. If you're desert setting, then you can research cactuses, like I did a lot researching cactuses. I had a Spanish setting, so I found a document that had Spanish names from the 14th century, common Spanish first names, and use those names to give a more historical feel to my story. So yeah, research is very important in world building as much as it is for like a historical fiction or not your nonfictions, or that research for this story as much as you do for fantasy and science fiction. You need that research too.
So where do you go for some of yours? You said you found some documents, or you just dig wherever you can?
What are good names for Spanish people in the 1400s?
Google is our friend most of the time. It is.
For sure. That's really, I think that's what most people use anymore.
I like that you say you're a pantser, but you still are researching.
Yeah, researching as I go. So as needed. If I need something, then I'll take a break from writing and dig into it. And I started, for more complex stories, I would start a Word document where I keep character names. If you get so many characters, it's hard to keep track and make sure you're spelling them right all the time and all that. Yeah. Start with a Word document, keep your character names in it, your place names, your rivers, your cities, all that, history, the background, that kind of stuff. You can keep it all there so you can head back and find it again.
So you keep a world Bible then too, don't you? Or it sounds or at least loosely. Yeah. So.
And even for new clients I've signed, I had to take notes and pretty much make my own little world Bible, like you called it, and make sure that I could keep track of all their characters and all the terms they're using. So that can be very helpful.
Consistency is everything, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. So what, in your opinion, is the most challenging aspect of world building, and how do you suggest writers overcome that?
I think really hard part is making your different cultures very distinct. If you have two kingdoms that are coming together, or allies or enemies or whatever, they need to feel different. They need to be not the same culture, not the same values, not the same economy, not the same history, and maybe even religion, to try and make each one feel separate and truly a different people. There's definitely ways they can be alike, but I think it takes a lot of work to make more than one culture in a fantasy story or a science fiction story and make them feel absolutely distinct and unique.
Yeah, that's, again, we're back to that, making the world a character. So you've got to set it up so that it sounds like they're opposing each other, so that they're in conflict just as much as your characters are in conflict. So setting kingdoms or parts of the world against each other so that there's conflict there. That's...
Like you said, so if your world building is a character, then if you have different cultures, maybe the different world building character for each one then.
Yeah. And I think it's important to remember too, when you're in a world, there are things like resources that are important in different ways to cultures. And there's sometimes a lack of resources or a limited that can also be a big part of why people do things or motivations for your characters or provide conflict too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Different cultures can have huge conflict just by having different points of view.
So do you dip into, like you talked about history, do you dip into history and look at different cultures from historical perspectives?
Yeah, it's a great source to go to. Maybe you want to look into 11th century Scotland and use that as the basis for your world, or other countries, and take values and how they lived then and research that and use that in your world building.
Yeah. Some good sources there, that's for sure. Yeah. So in your culture, we talked a little about the economics and the social norms. When you're doing a scene, how much of the world do you put in that scene?
You could have scenes where you don't need any world building. You can have scenes where you need very little. And then it depends on the scene. If you're like changing to a new setting, new people, new characters coming into a scene, then you probably need a lot more world building than you would if, say, your current characters that everybody's been reading about so far in the book are just having a love scene, for example, or something like that. Probably wouldn't need as much world building.
As long as the lovers are both humanoid, right?
Yeah.
So when you're doing your worlds, here's a question. What are you doing with magic versus technology, or magic and technology? How are you incorporating those into your worlds?
With magic and technology, I feel like there's a couple ways you can go. You can either have your magic very unlimited, very nebulous out there, and it doesn't have very many rules. Or you can have your magic and technology that have a lot of rules to it. A lot of things you can and can't do, and everybody understands what the rules are, and can become a real obstacle for your characters, which is one of the things about having a really hard magic system or hard science fiction technology, that there's limitation. Why I feel like more like sometimes a lot of witch stories be unlimited magic. There's not really rules what they can and can't do. It's almost like they're pulling their magic out of a hat because there are no rules. So you don't know what's allowed and what's not allowed. And they're just like, whoop, I did this now. So I prefer the magic systems with more rules. Mm-hmm. Like in Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn series, there's very specific rules, how long the magic lasts, what you can do, what you need to have to do the magic and that kind of thing. I find that more challenging a lot of times, that if there's a rule, then that becomes more of an obstacle and a conflict point for the character. And there's things that they might want to accomplish, but they can't do it because the rules of the magic won't let that. So.
Yeah, and I feel like it is more relatable too, right? Because there's nothing in life comes for free.
Yes.
And so it feels like when you have this magic system where you can do this unlimited amount of stuff for zero energy out of your body, that just feels so unrealistic and so unrelatable. I'm like, okay, yeah, have I ever wished I could have a magic wand and just clean my house in 1 second? Yes. But when I think about it, I think about the magic wand that I can swish around and clean my house, but it still drains me of energy. That just seems more realistic and relatable.
I also get frustrated when there's a serious problem and you're wondering how they're going to get out of it, and then they literally just pull something out of the hat or pop a wand in and solve the problem. So it gives an out to the characters, for me as a reader, that's not fair. and it doesn't challenge in the story. It's like a cheat to the reader.
Yeah, for sure. I have to say that's one of the reasons I don't like time travel a lot, because they just use it as a problem solver. I'm not saying most writers do that, but even in the Star Trek movies, that seems to be how they solve their problems. Well, they just die in trouble and they go back and they fix it. And that just seems like easy out to me.
Yeah. What about?
And it cuts your character growth too. Like your character doesn't grow when it has that.
What about technology
in
though?
there.
You were talking a little bit about the technology. What limits
Yeah.
do you put on those?
Yeah, I mean, you can set your story in a time period that's only a little ways ahead of our current time, and then your technology will be more limited, and maybe have to put more work in by the characters in order to solve the problems. Or you can reach out, go way in the future and come up with some really wild and different things that make the story absolutely unique. So there's something to be said about both ways of using technology. If we're keeping it close to what we have now or coming up with something completely unknown.
But again, the limits. Tech is not free. Our cars run on gasoline.
Breaks down.
And they're
You can't find
limited
cars.
resources and all of those things are. I think that's got to be an important part in any story to make it, to me as a reader, real and relatable, because I can't imagine a world where we don't have to worry about that. Then there wouldn't be any problems. That could be really fun, but probably not a great story to read.
The great story, that would be utopia, right?
Which I think as humans will never exist because we're all too.
We have different.
We got to have something to complain
Plus,
about.
we have different views of what utopia is. We don't even agree on that.
That's for sure. Yeah,
Like-
that's true.
Like in The Matrix, when they tried making it too perfect,
Yeah,
everybody was trying to find a way out. They didn't believe it.
absolutely.
Yeah,
That's
That's true.
something else. What are some of your favorite books or stories that have, or even movies that have really good world building elements?
I have to say, like Brandon Sanderson books, amazing world building, Robert Jordan books, Eye of the World, and the Wheel of Time series,
Love
which is
that.
now on Amazon Prime. He was just amazing with making cultures be completely unique and just fascinating how he got a ton of world building in, which is probably a little too heavy for books. But yes, there's still a lot of great world building stories that are coming out lately, like the Murderbot series in science fiction, the Jasmine Throne, Nettle and Bone, all great epic fantasy with great world building. And that's a great way to learn how much world building to have in your story is to read current releases and really learn about that stuff.
I think one of my favorite world building examples is Red Rising by Pierce Brown, because you start in this very relatable, very family setting. They're dancing, they're socializing after work. That is so relatable. But then as the world expands, you realize, oh, you're down in the ground. Oh, we're on Mars. Oh, we're in this like poverty stricken working class, and there's these super elite rich people. So it's just, the more you get into it, it's just layered and layered and layered. But it comes in when you enter the world, it's in this really small, tight, relatable space that then you fall in love with the characters, and then the world just takes you away. I think it's brilliantly done.
I do
Yeah.
love that, where any story where like you get bits of it at a time. And I guess that's what you're saying, that the modern ones now, we need to get digestible bits of the world as you go along. And then it adds so many more layers and so much more depth and surprise in reading it too, but logical surprise. Yeah. I enjoy this too.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Thank you for being with us, Michelle. I think this is an interesting discussion and hopefully helps people with their world building woes.
Yeah, I hope I know.
Oh, you did. Definitely.
You did.
Thank
Absolutely.
you so much.
It was great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks for everyone in Wayward Writers Land for joining us. We hope this helps you to conquer your path.